Hey everybody, how's it going? So today I want to start a new deep dive series. Now the last series that I did was the Beatles' US Capitol albums, and for this series I'm going to be covering the Rolling Stones London albums. So basically we're looking at the Rolling Stones' first album all the way through the Flowers album. So I'm not as well versed on the Rolling Stones as I am the Beatles, but I will do the best that I can. So the first album that we're going to be covering is England's newest hitmakers, the Rolling Stones. Now technically it's just called the Rolling Stones. However, because you've got England's newest hitmakers across the top there, people have come to know this album and refer to it as the England's newest hitmakers album. It was not intended to be that way. And as a matter of fact, on the CD, the spines of the CD just say the Rolling Stones. So every CD that's been issued of this album has just had the Rolling Stones, and that's how technically it's supposed to be referred to. Now, this album was released in May of 1964, which was about a month and a half after the original album, the UK album, which was just called The Rolling Stones. Now, unlike Meet the Beatles, there's not a whole lot of difference between this and the UK album. There are some subtle differences. For instance, the very first track on here that you have is Not Fade Away. That was the third UK single that the Rolling Stones released. However, in the UK album, it was replaced by Mona, I Need You Baby, which was slotted, I believe it was the fourth track on here. So the UK album opens with Route 66, and then the rest of this album, with the exception, or the rest of this side one and side two for that matter, pretty much reflect the same UK track listing. Now, there are differences in some of the song titles. The song Now I've Got a Witness is on the UK album, it was actually called Now I've Got a Witness, and in parentheses, like Uncle Gene and Uncle Phil. Now, Uncle Gene and Uncle Phil are Gene Pitney and Phil Spector, who were part of the sessions for this album. So I think that's just sort of a nod in gratitude for the two of them for contributing. And then also Tell Me, on the UK album, in parentheses, has You're Coming Back. So that's the full title on the UK album, and the US is just called Tell Me. Now, for us in the US, we're not as familiar with the UK versions of these albums as we are the Beatles album, because the UK versions were never released properly on CD, except there was a box set, 1964, I believe, through 1967. It was a limited release, and so you could get the original UK albums on CD that way, but that has since gone out of print, so there's not any way to get the UK albums on CD. You have to buy them as imports, and they're not as available as the the UK Beatle albums are. So for most of us, I would say all of us in the US who are a big Rolling Stones fan, with a few exceptions, these are the albums that we came to know, and these are the albums that were released on CD. So subsequent generations of Rolling Stones fans were also under the impression that maybe the Rolling Stones albums were released in this lineup with these album titles, but that's not the way that it was. But in any event, the Rolling Stones, this was their first album, and so you only have technically 3 original songs on this album. You have Now I've Got a Witness, which is an instrumental. You've got Little by Little, which is a regular song, but both of those songs are credited to Nanker Felge, which they would use that pseudonym whenever it was a group composition. So instead of putting, Watts, Jones, Jagger, Richard, Wyman, they just called it Nanker Felge. And I think a lot of fans didn't realize that those were actually Rolling Stones compositions. The only one that's really credited to Jagger, Richard on here is Tell Me. That's the only composition that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards would take credit for on here. But you've got a number of different cover songs. You've got Route 66, which was a Bobby Troop song. You've got I Just Want to Make Love to You, which was a Willie Dixon composition. You've got Honest I Do by Jimmy Reed. You've got James Moore's I'm a King Bee, Chuck Berry's Carol, which they would do a live version of on Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. an excellent version of that. You've got Can I Get a Witness, which was a Motown song. I believe it was a Marvin Gaye had covered that. That was a Holland Dozier Holland composition. You Can Make It If You Try, which was a song written by Ted Jarrett. And then you've got Walking the Dog, which actually Aerosmith covered on their first album. That was a song by Rufus Thomas. So yeah, you've got some liner notes here, which are written by Andrew Loog Oldham. These are a little more coherent than the liner notes we would get on subsequent Rolling Stones album. But this is the back cover of the album. This is the CD version, the original release, which has this digitally remastered banner down here, which was a new thing. These CDs came out in the late 80s, and so something being digitally remastered didn't really mean a whole lot to CD buyers back in the day. Kind of made it seem like, oh, it's a new and fresher way to hear a CD. But they would subsequently get remastered in an SACD form, which is this version. But this is what the back of this CD looks like. It's got the Abco, which is Alan Klein, and his wife's initials, and then company. You got that instead of the London Records logo there. And then this was the remaster, the first time the Rolling Stones CDs had gotten a true remastering. I think it was back in the late 90s. And then you've got this, they took the photographs on the back and kind of put them on the CD label itself. And then the back somewhat replicates what the original album looked like. The sound on here is incredible. But yeah, as a first album, I don't think it's as strong as Meet the Beatles. The Rolling Stones in their early albums did a lot of R&B covers, a lot of Motown covers, a lot of blues covers, and I think they do them well. They're not better than the original, but you could say the same for some of the Beatles covers that they did. Do the Beatles really, in some cases the Beatles did improve on it. Rolling Stones, I think these are interesting. It's a nice gateway if you're interested in getting into, the electric Chicago blues and some R&B stuff. But, at this point, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were not established songwriters. They were still kind of finding their footing. You had Andrew Loog Oldham, their manager, who was encouraging them to write more. And so it'd be like another 2 albums before their songwriting kind of came to full flower. But I think it's a solid enough album. The Rolling Stones worshipped at the feet of Howlin' Wolf and Willie Dixon and Muddy Waters and all those, Jimmy Reed, all those classic blues artists. So this is a labor of love, and they do excellent covers of these songs. And I find it enjoyable. I do like the blues. If you're not a blues fan, you're probably not going to want to start here, or at least, the Rolling Stones that you're more familiar with are probably going to be like the mid-60s Rolling Stones. But I like these early Stones records a lot. The original album came with I believe it was a poster on the US version. But interestingly, the UK album did not have any title at all. Did not have the Rolling Stones on the cover. It just had a little Decca logo on it. So you can imagine, the UK walking into the shops and like, ooh, you've got kind of like the Rolling Stones. It's sort of the same way that Robert Freeman did on the cover of With the Beatles, where you've kind of got them shaded. They're not smiling. They're just kind of looking almost a little menacing here on the cover, which I think is very cool. So anyway, yeah, I enjoy it. Not my favorite Rolling Stones album, but I think that it is a very solid debut album, if you will. And it's interesting that, it was so close in release date to the original UK release. But nonetheless, that is the Rolling Stones, England's newest hitmakers. So anyway, hope you enjoy this series. Let me know if you're looking forward to future ones, or if I should just cut it right here. But nonetheless, we'll see how far we get with this one. But I'm a big Rolling Stones fan, so I really want to do some more deep dives into these London albums. Hope you're doing great, and take care.